The Lisa Trilogy is a set of 3 games made by Austin Jurgensen, who goes by the alias Dingaling. The first, the painful, and the joyful. The trilogy is often compared to Undertale, though that comparison in my opinion is rather tenuous, and another better comparison can be made to Earthbound. Lisa has become a bit of a cult hit. It's not quite popular enough to be niche, and it's not quite niche enough to be popular. The first game, originally just called Lisa but now with the title The First added, is a free RPG Maker game released in 2012. It is the only game in which the protagonist Lisa is a playable character, and the only game in which she has a significant amount of screen time, though her fate is the driving force behind the plot of the following game. It follows the young girl, Lisa, as she imagines her escape from her abusive home within a nightmarish, abstract world in which her father is almost every character she meets. It is not, I should stress, a good game, and I would not recommend playing it. It doesn't look good, especially when blown up full screen, the music is rough, and the gameplay consists of finding items and dodging these weird spider things. Save yourself some time and frustration and just look at what happens. It isn't even necessary to understand the overarching plot of the 3 games, but it gives you some specific details on past events that are useful for setting the scene, so you might as well, so long as you don't waste your time actually playing it, or at least using a walkthrough if you do. Dingaling then ran a Kickstarter which got funded, and the game he made with the proceeds is called The Painful and was released in 2014. The difference between the first and the Painful is staggering. This new game has switched from a top-down perspective to a 2D one. It does have to be played in a 4:3 box when blown up full screen, and this also makes the game look just a tad fuzzy, but it's nothing game-ruining. The artwork is much cleaner and more refined with colours that pop. The areas are pretty dull to wander around in and aren't greatly distinct from one another. It's mostly just different foreground and background colours and then some different shaped shacks or some scaffolding or something similar to that. That is made up for though with the character design, which is inspired. Everyone has their own look, companions and bosses being the regular highlights, and then of course these monstrosities which have that kind of Attack on Titan grotesqueness to them. Dingaling joins the ranks of other solo indie devs who don't just draw, design and write their own games, for the most part single-handedly, such as Lucas Pope, Toby Fox and Eric Barone, but go so far as to even compose the music. The music in Lisa is a little more unorthodox, whereas their music sounds like this. Lisa's is more... It's not something I'm going to sit back and listen to for fun, but it suits the weird and wacky nature of this game. That being said, there was the odd track that got so hard on my ears that I actually had to take my headset off while playing. That is just the worst. The most impressive improvement is without a doubt the gameplay. from simple scavenger hunt to a shockingly well-designed RPG with a fun turn-based combat system. Where to even start? How about with the 30, yes, 30 unique and individual potential party members, each with their own skills and movesets, balanced to such an extent that almost any combination of these 30 is viable. You can have up to 4 party members at once. The protagonist, Brad, the only mandatory party member, uses Armstrong-style karate. This can be deployed by pressing the WASD keys in an unsequenced order to deliver 5 rapid attacks, through selected skills such as Fireball or Dropkick. Or why not do both, by using the WASD keys to input a certain order to get a few hits in before firing off the corresponding skill. Or you could use Olan, who builds up TP whenever he does a basic attack or is attacked, and can then use this to fire off a wide array of arrow attacks. Or there's Shocklord, who only does one attack, which is to trip up into the enemy and do massive AoE damage, if it hits, at the expense of not being able to do anything else. Or there's Nern, who can use his SP to buff your party, finger blast the enemy, or apply negative status effects to them. Which brings us to the long list of status effects that can be applied. I strongly advise that you take a screenshot of the list when you find it, or open the wiki when you play, because there is no easy way in-game to find the descriptions when you need them, which is an oversight because they add a great deal to the combat. It took me a little while to go looking for this myself, and I regret waiting so long. You can intuit what effect being poisoned, stunned, or silenced has, but good luck working out that a character who has been made wary has had their defense decreased by 70%. Or a character that is drunk now has -1 to attack speed, -30% to their hit rate, -20% to their evasion, +70% to their critical chance, +40% to their attack, -40% to their special attack, and -30% to their defense. One could argue that these buffs and debuffs are what elevate the combat from simple to interesting, but it's not the only factor. As you progress, you'll find all manner of equipment lying around. Usually these midlife crisis hats, sweaty wristbands, and children's blankets are worn by specific characters and will improve their stats. Aside from equipment, you've got your key items, like a child's bicycle that you can use to hop short gaps, and your consumable items. Let me ask you this. Do you play a lot of RPGs? Are your eyes glazing over at the mention of consumable items, thinking back to all those games that you beat without using more than a few health potions and the occasional mana potion? Well, toss that mindset now, because you need to use your items in this game. The painful, even on normal mode, isn't exactly hard, but it is challenging, and items are necessary. The most tempting of these items has to be Joy, the drug that heals you to full health, replenishes your SP, and applies a series of seriously powerful buffs. Though I'm not going to spoil anything here, but that might have consequences. Still, there's plenty more to choose from, whether they be petrol bombs, which do big damage and apply burning, perfume, which revives KO'd companions, cigarettes which cure poison, etc. Understand, these items are finite and wasting them isn't advised, but you can be liberal in your use of them, particularly in difficult fights. Don't feel like you're being forced to cheat by using items. The game has been designed with them in mind. And then there are other reasons not to be stingy with your items. But before I tell you why, I have to warn you, I'm about to dive into spoiler territory, so skip to here if you're not down with that. There are moments in the Painful where the game unapologetically dicks all over you. It uses what you have learned over your years of experience about how video games work, and it punishes you for using it. For example, when you rest, you're rolling the dice. You might wake up and be fine, or you could have some of your items stolen, or perhaps one of your companions will be kidnapped. Luckily, there's a chance to rescue said companion if you can find the ones who took him. If you do, you have the choice to pay the ransom, leave him, or just kill them and take him back. Of course, it's not really a choice, is it, my fellow gamers? Paying ransoms are for schmucks, naturally. Why would I pay for something that I can just take with a little bit of murder? Oh, that's right, because if you make it clear you have no intention of paying the ransom, then what reason do his kidnappers have to keep him alive? They can't do that. That's not how it's supposed to work, you cry, like the fat, whingy crybaby you are. Sorry, I might be projecting a little bit now. To circle back round to why you might not want to hold on to your items, there will be times where you'll be forced to make a difficult decision, such as having to choose between losing all your items or having one of Brad's arms chopped off, severely limiting his options in combat. Of course, you haven't learned your lesson yet, have you? You're eyeing up that juicy third option. You, being a gaming connoisseur, know to always choose the dialogue options that aren't linked to a clear choice when you are being forced to make a decision so you can get some more information. Wrong. This man does not want to answer your question, he asked you a question. Your arm or your items, but you know what? Now he's going to make that decision for you. He's taking your arm and all your items. Trust me, as much as I hate to admit it, I quite like some hand-holding in my video games. It took a lot of willpower for me to resist reloading after an event like this, which seems so unfair and at odds with typical video game logic. But that's the experience you're getting with the painful. It's painful. It's gonna punish you sometimes and you have to accept it. Don't worry, you're not gonna get stuck, but you might end up having a tougher time of things. Let's talk about my favourite part of this game. Lisa the Painful is one of the funniest games I have ever played. Now, that's an impressive feat for a 2D RPG Maker game where all the dialogue is text boxes and there's no voice acting. There isn't a whole lot in the toolbox for making people laugh. Dingaling manages it over and over again. This can be attributed to his ability to conjure up scenes, people and encounters that range from the random to the bizarre, and his faultless comedic timing. I could sit here and list off a dozen moments that made me laugh, but that would hardly do them justice, as coming across them in the wild and being caught off guard is how they continue to make you laugh. I'll use one example, partly because it is indicative of the comedic tone throughout, and partly because I'm going to refer back to it when I talk about the story. Fairly early on, you'll find this nice man looking after 6 young orphans, an admirable task in such a harsh world. While you're talking to him, Tommy here, who's fiddling with a match, accidentally sparks up a flame. Whoops! Not to worry, if you can just pass him that bucket of water over there, then we can get that flame put out. You, in your eagerness to comply, take the bucket and yourself throw the contents over the flame, subsequently setting the children on fire. Because that wasn't the man's water bucket, that was his gasoline bucket, you idiot. His water bucket is just over there. You hastily rush off to rectify your terrible error, but by the time you return it is too late, and all 6 children are now nothing more than 6 small piles of ash. It's the second most tragic thing to happen in his life. I can appreciate that having this moment described to you as opposed to experiencing yourself may influence how you perceived it. You may barely have cracked a smile, let alone a laugh. But if you can imagine coming upon this moment yourself, if you think it would have amused you, well, I've got good news. The Painful is full of these darkly comic encounters, and they're too good to get tired of. For me, it was how much the game made me laugh that elevated the experience to a highly enjoyable one. But there's another part that a lot of people loved even more. Or perhaps loved is the wrong word. As mentioned, the protagonist of The Painful is Brad Armstrong, son of Marty Armstrong, the abusive father from the first, and brother of Lisa Armstrong, the protagonist from the first. Lisa, at some point in the past, committed suicide, likely as a result of the abuse inflicted upon her, and Brad seems to shoulder a great deal of guilt over this, though how much responsibility he actually bears is not clear. Now in his 30s, he lives in Olath with his childhood friends, where civilization has broken down after an event known as the Flash killed every woman on the planet. One day, he stumbles upon a baby girl and raises her as his adopted daughter. However, guilt-ridden over his inability to protect his sister and terrified of what the outside world will do to a young girl in a womanless society, he exercises excessive control over her, essentially keeping her trapped. When Brad returns to find his daughter, Buddy, gone, he sets out to rescue her. But does Buddy want to be rescued by Brad? Is this a kidnapping or is this an escape? Alarm bells start ringing when you find her and she clearly doesn't want to come with you. You give her no choice, but she is taken from you straight away. Still, you doggedly pursue her, finding her again. This time she runs away from you. Still, you pursue her, finding her again. You murder your childhood friends, your dad, your companions, an army, and the peace-loving warlord who leads it, all so you can once again reach her and be told, she does not want you. And with that, Brad dies, and then he transforms into one of those monstrosities you've seen so many of, a joy mutant. Mutated by the drug he's addicted to, he crawls slowly towards a sleeping Buddy, calling out his dead sister's name. I wonder what will happen? Well, we'll find out in a bit, but first, that was a quick rundown, but it covers the major plot points. The Painful story receives a lot of praise for its emotional narrative and dark themes, and I agree to an extent. For one, I appreciate how directly and unflinchingly the topics of suicide, abuse, rape, and other such fun conversation starters are tackled. You can be assured that only a small indie game would dare to so explicitly face these mature and uncomfortable themes. It makes for a grown-up story which doesn't hide behind inferring and implying. That being said, I found it difficult to emotionally invest myself in a dark story that's told in between moments of dark comedy. It's not easy to balance comedy and tragedy, and it almost always leans one way at the expense of the other. This is why I highlighted the children on fire part earlier. That moment was funny. Accidentally burning those children to death made me laugh, as it was supposed to. So why now should I care so much about this other child? How do I reconcile finding this hilarious and this horrifying? Personally, I can't. The story doesn't develop all that much either. Once you find Buddy the first time and it becomes clear she doesn't want to go with you, you don't need the specifics to get a general idea about what's going on. You can work out at that moment why Buddy doesn't want to go with Brad, just you can figure out why Brad is so desperate that she does. The story became the underlying driving force for why Brad pushes on, something I suppose it needed because the combat and comedy aren't reason enough. But that's what it stayed for me. It never matched the fun of trying out a new combination of party members, or the pure unbridled joy of not knowing what new strangeness was around the corner. It's going to be a middle finger at the top of this. Aww. Lisa the Joyful, the third and final game in the trilogy, released as DLC for the Painful, commits what some would cite as the greatest of sins in games development, sacrificing gameplay for story. What I was most looking forward to in the Joyful was more of what I had enjoyed in the Painful, naturally. So while I wasn't expecting 30 new party members, I was looking forward to 5 or 6 and a spate of fresh funnies. I was disappointed to get next to nothing of this. You play as Buddy now and you get a single other party member, Rando, the peace-loving warlord you thought Brad had killed just before. Even worse, Rando leaves about a third of the way into the game and from that point on, it's all Buddy. No mixing and matching, no cool combos, just Buddy's moveset of which you'll probably use mostly the same strategy throughout. It makes for less interesting fights in which you can easily lose to stuns, there only being one of you to stun, and later some very long fights which become tedious. I would be interested to know if you can complete the Joyful without the use of Joy, because I certainly tried, knowing full well that using Joy in the Painful affects your ending. But I reached a point where it just didn't seem possible, at least not without the use of her healing skill, which I didn't get until near the end of the game. However, as it turns out, using Joy has no effect on your ending, and as you receive large quantities of it throughout the game, I would assume that you're now supposed to use Joy to get by. The humour is mostly gone as well, favouring a more serious tone. There's still some stuff that feels like it could have come from the previous game, such as Buddy flustering enemies by showing them her breasts, which leaves you not knowing whether to laugh or shift in your seat uncomfortably. This all makes sense in relation to the story. Buddy is saved from Monster Brad at the start of the game, and after teaming up with Rando, she sets out to slaughter the 6 rulers of Olath, some of whom clearly don't deserve to die. Buddy has become so against the world that she is blind to this injustice. It makes sense for Rando to leave, too disgusted with Buddy's actions to continue aiding her. And it makes sense that there are no further companions to be recruited, because Buddy doesn't trust anyone else. With the exception of Rando, it's her against the world. It all makes sense, but it's such a shame from a gameplay perspective, and the game is far duller for it. I suppose I can't complain about tonal inconsistency now, with a flashback to when Brad forced Buddy to kill a tied-up man with a knife in the interest of learning to defend herself, and another scene where it genuinely looks like Buddy is going to get raped. I don't think Dingaling is trying to make me laugh anymore. But then, after you've killed your 6th and final ruler, you're chucked into an explosive finale which answers questions that you didn't even have. Suddenly there's a big bad evil guy and visions of Rando and Brad and characters repenting, and all of this just gets dumped on you in one big go right at the end, just before you make a big final choice that doesn't relate all that well to anything the game has been about up to that point. I'm sad to say, it was a bit of a disappointment. My conclusions. First, don't play Lisa the First. There's little need to expand upon this, I've given my reasons. It's not necessary or worth it. The Joyful? That's up to you, and I think largely depends on how much you connect with the more serious side of the plot. If Past Me phoned me up on the old interdimensional telephone and said, "Hey buddy, how about that Joyful DLC?" I'd probably tell him that for him, he wasn't missing much by skipping it. But then again, he might counter with, "But it's only £4 £60 at full price and only takes a few hours to beat. To which I'd probably say, fine, fuck it, get it then, see if I care. You're not going to lose much by giving it a go. But try the Painful, for sure. It's well worth playing. I'd recommend it to any competent gamer who likes a varied selection in their gaming diet. Combat, comedy, even story. Just because I didn't like it doesn't mean you won't. And if you're going to like the story, the Painful has the best of the three. It's unconventional, and for some it will be too uncomfortable an experience, but it deserves its place alongside the other critically acclaimed solo dev games that the indie revolution has gifted us.